name's Jyoti Fernandes. I work with the Landworkers Alliance, which is a union for farmers, foresters, and land-based workers based in the UK. And we're a part of Via Campesina, which means the peasant way of life, which is a union or a network of unions all around the world in 182 different countries, representing peasant farmers, indigenous people, and small and family farms, producing food for their local economies all over the world. I work as a farmer in Dorset. It's a family farm, and there's lots of new entrants coming and working on our farm. It's part of a cooperative of smallholders, and we make, meat products, apple juice, cider, dairy products, preserves, all sorts of things that we sell at local markets and through local BOP schemes. And it's an exciting way to be a part of a vibrant local economy. Now I get less time to do the work on the farm and on the land than I used to, but my family, my daughter, and other new entrants to farming are starting to take over a lot of the work on the farm, so it's still a vibrant community of producers. And what it means to me to be a part of that is that when I try and do the advocacy work that I do on behalf of Via Campesina, working with UK government and with lots of institutions on trying to make life better for small scale producers, is that I really understand what people have gone through. I started out into farming new to the British countryside, and it was a real learning curve to try and get access to land, to get planning permission to live on the land with my family, to try and make a living doing small scale farming when the conditions that are there are very difficult for small scale farmers to make a living, because you're up against globalized trade, you're up against a system that works for corporations to make more profit, and it drives down all sorts of things like animal welfare standards, standards on pesticides. There's so much stuff that's sprayed in loads of chemicals that you're competing against when you're trying to be organic. And I realized doing that, and also watching so many young people and new entrants to farming really want to get into occupations that are based on the land, and realizing there's such a lack of support out there. All these things I learned from them, and that's the experience that I bring into the union that I work with, because we realized that as a union, we need to work together to collectively organize to try and change conditions so that it's easier to do the job that we do, so that we can bring on the next generation so they have better opportunity to make a living from small scale farming. And that experience really informs the advocacy work that we do today. The Landworkers Alliance works in the UK to lobby the UK government to change how the subsidy system works, to change how the grants for new entrants to farming are distributed, so that new entrants can get startup capital and get training and the kind of learning opportunities to be able to farm in a way that's productive and works in harmony with the environment. We do a lot of work to try and stop trade agreements that might bring in products that undercut the standards that we have here in the UK, so that farmers can have a fairer livelihood. We do a lot of work to also think about the local food infrastructure. How is food stored and processed and distributed? Whether that's small scale abattoirs that local farmers can, work with to make sure that, how their animals are killed and processed is humane, or distribution facilities so that, we can have hubs so that local food can be produced by small scale producers and then distributed to people in schools and hospitals. All these kinds of things are things that we work with the UK government to try and leverage more support for local food economies, because there's been underinvestment for decades in local food economies and too much focus on global trade. And we want to reverse that to really bring food back home. The Landworkers Alliance has been advocating for a while, the last 10 years, to try and be a key stakeholder in the discussions about food and farming that take place on a governmental level. We had to really push ourselves through to put ourselves in that position, because there's another farmers union, the National Farmers Union, which represents larger landowners and industrial farming predominantly. They do have small scale farmers, but they don't actually speak up for them very well. And we gained ground. At first we were ignored, but we really needed to put ourselves forward through people really getting out and starting to talk to MPs. And we did a lot of demonstrations outside of the Agriculture Department and started to make our voice visible, because, contrary to what the other farmers unions were saying, we believe that food production and biodiversity and climate change adaptation can all go together, that we can actually do all of it at the same time, and that with agroecological farming, farming that works with nature, we can achieve all of that. And so slowly we've gained ground. We were a part of helping pass the Agriculture Act, which was to shift subsidies from being distributed on the basis of how much land people own to how they farm, to try and restore biodiversity, look after soil, and try and do lots of environmental land management techniques on their farms. And so now I currently sit on the panel. Lots of our campaigns team actively work with government to try and develop those schemes, alongside loads of other ones like the New Entrant Scheme and others that we've advocated for. We're really at the table and trying to work on those, but there is a lot of vested interest that we're up against every time we work on these things. You know, you get a lot of lobbying from corporations, from farmers with really entrenched vested interest in trying to maintain the model that they've got on their farms, that really push back a lot. And, you know, it's slow but steady progress. And I think as wider public awareness is opening up, as more people understand and then voice the need for a change to how we manage our land use systems, then it is becoming easier to do this. But when we really try and push against things like multinationals coming in and getting a foot into our economy through trade agreements or genetically modified crops, we find it incredibly difficult, because it's very clear that no matter how much civil society mobilizes, that corporate power is extremely difficult, and it's very slippery, and they're very clever. On the international level, we do a lot of work with the Food and Agriculture Organization, at the climate change talks, and in many other places like the World Trade Organization negotiations, to try and make space for this huge movement to have their voices heard, this huge grassroots movement of peasant farmers, indigenous people, small and family farms, and consumers who really want more connection to their food, more control over their food systems, and to have healthy, affordable, sustainably produced food accessible to all. It's people who are concerned about the right to food, right? And we call that the civil society movement, to try and promote the right to food. It's very difficult in those spaces to try and make our voices heard, because on the international level, often private sector interests, they call it the private sector mechanism, you know, Bill Gates, Nestle, McDonald's, Archer Daniels Midland, all these multinational corporations that control the industrial food chain, actually have a seat at the table. They're actually given spaces at the Committee on Food Security to put their perspectives forward on par with civil society, which is an incredibly frustrating situation to be in. And then you go to places like the climate change talks, where peasant farmers, indigenous people, youth, women, you know, lots of different sectors of society are there at the table to negotiate. But at the same time, we're incredibly marginalized against the interests of, you know, people trying to do carbon trading and different, you know, put forward solutions like Aim for Climate, which are about, sustainable intensification as a solution to climate. And they capture so much of the money and the political interest that's out there to deal with these crises we face. And so we're always having to mobilize, we're always having to be strategic, and we're always trying to get the finance we need to be able to make our voices heard in a way that's actually going to make a difference in pushing forward what we know is a real viable solution to all the crises we face. Pre the Green Revolution, pre-1950s, all of the world in the planet was produced through localized food systems that were incredibly diverse and worked with local landscapes, so that we had a huge, you know, array of different ways that food was produced and processed and distributed that really met the cultural and spiritual identity of the places that food was being produced. And then the idea arose of the industrial food chain, the Green Revolution, which converted agriculture over to monoculture crops and using chemical inputs and being produced, you know, in a very uniform way so it could be sold across the planet. And that started to arise, and a lot of money sort of went towards that development model. But despite the fact that what we call the industrialized food chain was given so much prominence and in many ways controls the narrative of what produces our food, it's still the case that today 80% of global food security is produced through the agroecological food webs, agroecological localized food webs that are largely controlled by peasant farmers and small-scale farmers selling to their local communities, providing food self-sufficiently for their families, and working in many different ways to make sure that a diverse, you know, array of different sorts of foods are available that meet people's real nutritional security in a culturally appropriate way. And that 80% is produced using only 20% of agricultural resources, where conversely, the industrialized food chain only produces 20% of global food security using 80% of global resource. So it's producing that food, overproducing foods. We actually have more net calories of food out there in the world today than we need to be able to feed the planet. And a huge amount of that is wasted or being produced incredibly inefficiently through inefficient forms of factory farming. All the soya that's being produced on the outskirts of the Amazon that's being used to be fed to animals is an incredibly inefficient way to use our agricultural resource to produce, a few amount of calories of food. And there's a huge amount of food waste in the industrialized food chain as well. There's also a lot of food that becomes ultra processed and leads to dietary related health problems and things like that. So the reality is, even though people think the industrialized food chain is feeding people, it's actually small scale localized food systems that are, and that's been proven through a lot of research that illustrates that. The problem is getting that message out in a way that people understand. And there's examples from Via Campesina, my organization, all across the world of the way that the small scale can actually be organized to be multiplied to provide at scale. If you look at India, the Indian dairy farmers have the largest dairy production capacity in the world. 90 million small-scale dairy producers with an average herd size of 3 cows, producing on a very small scale through methods that don't require loads of soya and inputs for their cows. They use waste products largely to feed cows, and that's integrated into a system designed to feed humans nutritious food security. And then that is consolidated together and redistributed through small-scale distributors, to feed the population. That's mass-scale production from small-scale producers. And those kind of examples of cooperatives, of collective organizing, of ways that we can strategically think about getting small-scale production to be scaled up to be able to provide the bulk of our food security is something we should be thinking more strategically about. Right now, we're leaving everything to the market. We're leaving it to corporations to plan what our food system should look like. And that's the very worst way we can possibly organize something that's actually everybody's basic human right. Via Campesina believes in the principle of food sovereignty. Food sovereignty means that access to the means to produce the food that we need should be in the hands of local people. That's access to land, to water, to seeds, to the right political framework to be able to protect that localized food production. And we believe that the best agricultural land, the best resource should be there to feed the local population and in control of the local population so that they can have access to producing diverse foods that feed the people there. What happens with global trade is that often that best agricultural resource is being used to produce luxury commodity crops to feed other spaces. And those export crops often take away the resources from local communities that they need to be able to feed their own populations. And it may be that money flows back into the local communities, but that doesn't always happen. A lot of the time, those operations, that money is actually flowing to corporations and is being, there to provide economic development for very few people, and often people that are, not treated properly, poor working conditions, very poor wages, because they're spiraled down, problems with workers' conditions in other countries when in the globalized economy, one place can be bartered against the other and global corporations source from wherever is cheapest. And so it's a myth that countries across the global south need to have export markets in order to have economic development in their countries. What would be a better economic development model is to try and think about food sovereignty, and that the best agricultural resource in countries is there for countries to be able to produce food for themselves, and helping enable access to the land for small-scale farmers to be able to feed their local communities and to support their domestic food economies.